It was an ordinary Tuesday morning on November 14th, 1995, in the quiet suburbs of Larkwood, California. Jane Whitman, a 32-year-old mother of three, woke up early, as she always did, to prepare breakfast for her children. Her husband, Mark, had already left for work, leaving her to handle the morning rush. The Whitman home was a picture of suburban perfection: neatly trimmed lawns, freshly painted shutters, and a sense of calm that permeated the neighborhood. But that calm would soon shatter. After packing lunches and making sure her kids were ready, Jane dropped her children, Madison 10, Ryan 7-10. She waved goodbye from her minivan, smiling as she watched them disappear into the building. That was the last time anyone would see Jane Whitman. By noon, Mark hadn't heard from Jane, which was unusual. She always called him around lunchtime, updating him on errands or chatting about the kids. By 3 p.m., when Jane hadn't returned to pick up their children from school, alarm bells started ringing. Calls to her cell phone went straight to voicemail, and when Mark returned home that evening, there was no sign of her. The groceries she had planned to buy remained unpurchased, and the family's calendar was untouched on the kitchen wall, frozen in time. Jane Whitman had vanished. A frantic search ensued. Family, friends, and neighbors combed the neighborhood. Police scoured the area, investigating possible leads, but no one had seen anything. Jane's minivan was found parked neatly in the driveway, her purse still inside the house. The lack of clues baffled investigators, and after months of fruitless searching, the case went cold. Jane Whitman had seemingly disappeared into thin air. Larkwood was never the same after Jane's disappearance. It became a town defined by whispers and unease, a place where mothers double-checked their locks and fathers stayed up late watching the windows. The missing posters eventually faded, but the memory of Jane lingered in every conversation. Her children grew up, each bearing the scars of that fateful day. Mark, once an active part of the community, retreated into a quiet, shadowed version of himself. He moved the family to a smaller home on the outskirts of town, away from the reminders of the life they once had. Madison, Ryan, and Emily were haunted by the gaping hole left by their mother's absence. Madison, the eldest, grew up too fast, taking on the role of caretaker for her siblings while her father worked long hours. Ryan buried himself in his studies, and Emily, the youngest, clung to the few memories she had of her mother, trying to piece together the fragments of her childhood. Years passed, and Jane's case became nothing more than a sad story shared by Larkwood residents, a cautionary tale told to new families about the tragedy that once struck their seemingly idyllic neighborhood. Every few years, the police would revisit the case, following up on dead-end leads and vague sightings, but nothing substantial ever surfaced. Then, in 2015, 20 years after Jane Whitman vanished, a strange call came into the Larkwood Police Department. A woman had appeared at a homeless shelter in Sacramento, claiming she had no memory of her past. Disoriented and confused, she said she believed she was Jane Whitman, the suburban mother who had disappeared all those years ago. The shocking news sent a ripple through the town. Might it really be her? And if so, where had she been for 2 decades? The woman was in her 50s, her face weathered by years of hardship, yet there was something hauntingly familiar about her idea. When police in Sacramento interviewed her, she claimed to have vague flashes of memories: a house, children, a life she couldn't quite place. But the most striking revelation was her name, Jane Whitman. She spoke it with an uncertainty that only deepened the mystery. The police were cautious but intrigued, knowing the history of Jane's disappearance. The news quickly reached Larkwood. When Mark Whitman heard about the woman claiming to be his long-lost wife, he felt a mixture of disbelief and hope, emotions that had long been buried. Could this really be Jane? After all these years, could she have somehow survived, only to forget her life and vanish into the shadows of the world? Mark reluctantly agreed to meet the woman. Madison, now 30 and living on her own, accompanied him, though she shared his skepticism. She had been just a child when her mother disappeared, and the years had blurred her memories. But deep down, a part of her still longed for closure, for answers to the questions that had haunted her for 2 decades. When they arrived at the shelter, the woman stood nervously in the corner of the room. She glanced up as they entered, her eyes locking onto Mark's. Then Madison's. Silence filled the air as Mark slowly approached her. "Jane," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman hesitated, then gave a faint nod, her lips trembling. "I think so. I don't know who else I could be." Mark stood frozen, unsure of what to say or feel. He didn't know this woman, and yet, somewhere deep inside, something stirred an old, forgotten connection. Madison, too, felt a strange sensation, a pull toward this woman who claimed to be the mother she barely remembered. The police, along with medical professionals, began the painstaking process of verifying the woman's identity. DNA tests were ordered, but that would take time. In the meantime, she was placed under psychological evaluation to determine the extent of her amnesia. The woman could recall fragmented moments, like playing with children in a backyard or watching the sunset from a porch, but these memories were disjointed, incomplete. Larkwood, once again, buzzed with speculation. Was this truly Jane Whitman? And if so, where had she been for 20 long years? The small town was on edge, bracing itself for what promised to be a revelation either deeply tragic or unimaginably shocking. As the DNA results were being processed, the woman who had now taken to calling herself Jane was moved into a temporary facility where she could receive better care. Begin working with a therapist to recover her lost memories. Mark and Madison visited regularly, though it was an awkward and emotional process. Jane struggled to connect with them, her mind fogged by 2 decades of apparent amnesia. Madison, despite her doubts, spent hours with the woman, showing her old family photos, sharing stories from her childhood. The woman smiled at the images but showed little recognition. Every now and then, though, something would spark a fleeting flash of memory that seemed to tie her to the life she once had. She remembered Madison's first day of kindergarten. She recalled a birthday party in their backyard, balloons floating in the wind. These moments, however brief, gave Madison hope. But for Mark, it was different. The woman in front of him was not the Jane he remembered. His wife had been vibrant, full of life, and sharp in every conversation. This woman was a shell of that person, broken, distant, and burdened by years that seemed unaccounted for. He wanted to believe, but doubt gnawed at him. Then the DNA results came back. The match was undeniable. The woman was Jane Whitman. The town was floored. Jane's return should have been a cause for celebration, but instead, it opened a Pandora's box of questions. How had she survived? Where had she been? And most troubling of all, why couldn't she remember? As the investigation deepened, the police looked into other missing persons cases from the past 20 years, cross-referencing with Jane's timeline. What they discovered was both bizarre and chilling. Jane had been spotted in various cities across the country over the years, though always under different names. There were records of her in Arizona, Nevada, and even as far as Colorado, always living transiently, working low-wage jobs, and staying under the radar. But it wasn't just the movement that disturbed investigators. In each location, there had been unsolved crimes, assaults, robberies, even a suspicious death that coincided with Jane's presence. The gentle suburban mother who had once baked cookies for her children now appeared to have a dark and unexplained past, a life that no one could reconcile with the woman they thought they knew. Mark and Madison found themselves pulled into the vortex of these discoveries, struggling to accept that the woman who had returned might not be the same person they had lost. As the news of Jane Whitman's identity spread, the local police dug deeper into the mysterious life she had led during her 2-decade absence. Investigators combed through every lead, trying to trace her steps across state lines. What they uncovered only added layers of confusion and suspicion. Jane had lived under various aliases: Lori Stevens in Nevada, Beth Cooper in Arizona, and Emily Harris in Colorado. Each identity seemed hastily constructed, yet well enough to evade suspicion for years. In each town she passed through, she kept a low profile, staying in cheap motels, working in small diners, or taking odd jobs in isolated towns. The few people who remembered her described her as quiet, withdrawn, and deeply private. She never stayed long enough to form lasting relationships, disappearing just as quickly as she arrived. But the most disturbing part was the trail of violence. Investigators found that each time Jane disappeared from a town, a string of incidents followed. There were reports of missing persons, brutal assaults, and in one particularly gruesome case, the suspicious death of a man in Nevada. His body had been found in a remote area with no obvious suspects. Police had long since closed the case, labeling it an unsolved mystery. But now, with Jane's resurfacing, they couldn't ignore the timing. It was hard for Mark and Madison to reconcile these revelations with the woman they knew or thought they knew. Could their mother, the woman who had once sung lullabies to them, have been capable of such things? And why couldn't she remember any of it? Despite the mounting evidence, Jane herself remained a puzzle. In therapy sessions, she expressed no memory of her life as Lori Stevens or Beth Cooper, nor could she recall any violent incidents. She insisted that her last clear memory was from 1995, dropping her kids off at school, driving away, and then a blank void until she woke up on the streets years later. Her confusion seemed genuine, but it left the family grappling with a terrifying question. Had Jane truly lost her memory, or was she hiding something far more sinister? As Jane's story became more entangled, the media caught wind of the case, sensationalizing the housewife with a dark secret narrative. Reporters flocked to Larkwood, turning the once quiet town into a spectacle. Neighbors who had once been sympathetic now whispered behind closed doors, their curiosity tinged with fear. Was the woman in their midst really Jane Whitman, or had she become someone else entirely during her years on the run? Mark found himself spiraling. He had held on to hope for so long, hope that his wife would return, hope that his family would be whole again. But the woman sitting across from him at the dinner table now felt like a stranger. She tried to reconnect, cooking meals like she used to, humming old tunes while she worked around the house. But there was an unmistakable distance between them, an unbridgeable gap. One night, as they sat together, Mark finally broke his silence. "Jane," he said, his voice heavy, "I need to know the truth. Where have you been? What really happened to you?" Jane looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She opened her mouth to speak, but hesitated, as if the words wouldn't come. Tears welled up in her eyes as she shook her head. "I don't know, Mark, I swear I don't remember anything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But sometimes I have dreams, nightmares. I see blood, I hear screams. I don't know if they're real or if it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. Could these nightmares be fragments of memories, buried deep within her subconscious, or were they merely the result of years of trauma, distorted by time and confusion? Madison, too, struggled with the return of her mother. She had grown up clinging to an idealized version of Jane, perfect, loving, and kind. But now, faced with this broken woman who couldn't account for 2 decades of her life, she didn't know what to feel. Was she supposed to forgive? Was she supposed to forget? As the days passed, Madison began to experience her own doubts. One night, while rummaging through old family photos, she came across something odd, a journal her mother had kept in the months leading up to her disappearance. Flipping through the pages, Madison saw that the entries became increasingly erratic over time. Her mother wrote about feeling watched, about strange cars parked outside their house, about having terrible headaches and blackouts. The final entry, dated just a week before Jane disappeared, chilled Madison to the bone. "I don't feel like myself anymore. Something's wrong. I'm scared. If anything happens to me, tell Mark I love him. Tell the kids I'm sorry." Madison stared at the words, her hands shaking. Could her mother have known something was coming? Had she been running from something or someone all along? The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together, and the more Madison dug into her mother's past, the more she realized that the truth might be darker than any of them could have imagined. Something had happened to Jane Whitman in 1995, something that had shattered her life and sent her spiraling into a nightmare from which she might never fully wake. Madison's discovery of her mother's journal ignited a whirlwind of questions. Had Jane been in danger before her disappearance? And if so, who or what was she running from? Madison brought the journal to the attention of the police, who reopened their investigation into Jane's final days in 1995. The strange notes about headaches, blackouts, and the feeling of being watched added a new layer to the mystery. They began to wonder if Jane's disappearance had been voluntary after all. Had she have been fleeing an unseen threat, or was she slowly losing her grip on reality? The investigation also took a hard look at Mark, scrutinizing his role in the years leading up to Jane's disappearance. While Mark had been cooperative and openly devastated at the time, the journal hinted at potential strains in their marriage. Jane had written about feeling isolated, struggling with being a stay-at-home mom, and Mark working long hours. There were small mentions of arguments, frustrations, and Jane's growing sense of paranoia, but nowhere did she indicate that she thought Mark had anything to do with her vanishing. Nevertheless, the police couldn't ignore the possibility. They interviewed Mark again, digging into his life over the past 20 years. Mark maintained that he had done everything possible to find Jane after she disappeared and had raised their children with the belief that she might someday return. He denied knowing anything about the headaches or blackouts Jane had mentioned in her journal. Still, doubt lingered in the minds of investigators. While the police pursued this angle, Madison took matters into her own hands. She revisited old family friends, hoping they could offer insights into the state of her mother's mental health before the disappearance. Most of them recalled Jane as a loving mother, but some noted her recent behavior had become erratic. One neighbor, Mrs. Carmichael, mentioned a disturbing incident that Madison had never heard about. "Just a few days before she disappeared, Jane came over late at night, banging on my door," Mrs. Carmichael said, her voice trembling slightly. "She looked scared, like she'd seen a ghost. She told me someone was following her, that she felt like she was being watched all the time. I tried to calm her down, but she was hysterical. The next morning she acted like nothing had happened, like she didn't even remember coming over. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think it would lead to this." Madison felt a sickening realization creep in. Could her mother's paranoia have been real? And had Jane been running from something far more sinister than just her own fractured mind? As the investigation into Jane's past deepened, the police discovered something they had previously overlooked: a report of a strange man seen in the neighborhood around the time of Jane's disappearance. Several residents had noted a white van parked down the street from the Whitman home for days on end, but no one had connected it to the case at the time. A neighbor had even seen the man once, standing by the van, watching the Whitman house. But when questioned 20 years earlier, it had been brushed off as insignificant. Now, with Jane's journal and the new evidence of her growing paranoia, the police took a fresh look at the lead. They traced the license plate of the van from old traffic camera footage, leading them to a man named Henry Croft. Croft had a history of mental health issues and a criminal record that included stalking and assault charges from the early 90s. But he had slipped through the cracks, disappearing from the system. When they finally located Croft, he was living in a rundown trailer park on the outskirts of Sacramento. Police brought him in for questioning, and under pressure, he admitted to watching Jane Whitman for several weeks before she vanished. He claimed he had been paid to follow her, though he refused to say by whom. Croft's story was fragmented, veering between reality and delusion. But one detail stood out. He mentioned seeing Jane meet with a man several times in the days leading up to her disappearance. This man, Croft insisted, wasn't Mark. The revelation rocked the investigation. Who was the man Jane had been meeting? And why had she kept it secret from everyone, even her family? As Croft's mental state deteriorated during questioning, he began talking about the voices and how they had warned him to stay away from Jane. The police dismissed much of his rambling as the product of a disturbed mind, but there was enough truth buried in his words to spark further inquiry. They searched through Jane's phone records from the time, And while they didn't find anything suspicious at first, a deep dive into her bank records revealed payments to a small motel on the outskirts of town. Jane had rented a room under an alias Patricia Saunders just 2 days before she disappeared. Madison's heart raced as she confronted the idea that her mother had been living a double life, hiding secrets from everyone. But why? And who was the man Jane had been secretly meeting? The investigation took a sharp turn when the police began piecing together surveillance footage from the motel. Though the footage was grainy and years old, they were able to identify a man arriving at the motel around the same time Jane had checked in. The man was none other than David Price, a contractor who had done work at the Whitman home in the months before Jane vanished. Price had a clean record, with no previous criminal charges, but his connection to Jane was undeniable. When the police questioned him, he initially denied knowing anything about her disappearance, but under mounting pressure, cracks began to show. He admitted to having an affair with Jane, something he said they both wanted to keep hidden from their families. But then, Price dropped a bombshell that no one saw coming. He hadn't seen Jane on the day she disappeared, but he was sure someone else had been following her. According to Price, Jane had been terrified in their final days together, convinced that her life was in danger. He claimed that she had talked about running away, starting fresh, leaving everything behind, including her family. Mark and Madison were left reeling from the revelations. Their grief, once rooted in a simple disappearance, had now evolved into a tangled web of betrayal, fear, and dark secrets. As the police closed in on the truth, one thing became clear. Jane Whitman had been caught in something far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And the real question remained, was she running from her past, or had it finally caught up to her? The revelations about Jane's affair and her secret life were like a punch to the gut for Mark and Madison. As much as they had wanted to believe that Jane's disappearance was the result of a kidnapping or some other external force, the truth was far messier. Jane had been living a double life, terrified and hiding from someone, perhaps not just her affair partner David Price, but from something even more dangerous. As the police zeroed in on David Price's confession and Henry Croft's disturbing account of being paid to follow Jane, it became clear that there were more players involved than initially thought. Someone had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, orchestrating Jane's surveillance, pushing her deeper into a web of fear. But who? Croft's erratic behavior and paranoid delusions made it difficult to separate fact from fiction. But one detail stood out. He had mentioned seeing Jane meet with another man, someone he had referred to as the one in charge, but when pressed, Croft became agitated and refused to say more. Then, in a shocking twist, the police discovered an overlooked detail buried deep within Jane's old phone record. She had made several calls to a private investigator in the months leading up to her disappearance. This investigator, a man named Thomas Garner, specialized in cases of domestic abuse, stalking, and blackmail. Jane had clearly been afraid of something or someone and had reached out for help. Garner, now retired, was tracked down in Arizona. When questioned by police, he remembered Jane Whitman immediately. He confirmed that Jane had hired him to investigate a man she believed was stalking her, someone who had been making threats, leaving ominous messages, and following her movements. But Garner's investigation had hit a dead end when Jane abruptly cut off contact 2 days before she disappeared. According to Garner, Jane had grown increasingly paranoid and insisted on secrecy. She refused to provide many details about the man who was threatening her, only that he had a connection to someone close to her. Garner tried to press her for more information, but Jane had been evasive, promising to meet with him one final time before going silent. The missing pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to fall into place, and it became clear that Jane's disappearance wasn't just about her affair or her attempts to escape her family. She had been entangled in a dangerous game of manipulation and fear orchestrated by someone in the shadows. But who? That's when the police revisited an old lead, Mark Whitman's business dealings. Mark had always been a respected member of the Larkwood community, but as they dug deeper, the police uncovered a shocking secret. Mark had been involved in a series of questionable financial transactions with a man named Robert Hale, a shady real estate developer with ties to organized crime. Hale had a history of using intimidation and blackmail to control his associates, and it was no secret that those who crossed him often paid a heavy price. Jane, it seemed, had stumbled onto something she wasn't supposed to know. As the police probed further, they uncovered evidence suggesting that Hale had discovered Jane's affair and had used it to threaten both her and Mark, trying to leverage Mark's financial vulnerability to gain control over his business. Jane had become a pawn in a dangerous game, trapped between protecting her family and fleeing for her life. Hale had hired Henry Croft to follow Jane, keeping tabs on her every move. But when Jane realized the depth of the danger she was in, she had tried to disappear, planning to meet with Thomas Garner one last time to hand over evidence of Hale's threats. She never made it to that meeting. The police now had their prime suspect, Robert Hale. With Robert Hale now at the center of the investigation, the police moved quickly to build their case against him. They uncovered a trail of extortion, blackmail, and intimidation that spanned years, tying him not only to Mark's financial troubles but also to the lives of others who had mysteriously fallen into ruin after crossing him. But the question remained, what had happened to Jane Whitman after that fateful November day in 1995? Under intense scrutiny, Hale denied any involvement in Jane's disappearance. He claimed to have no knowledge of her affair with David Price and dismissed any suggestion that he had threatened her. However, his denials fell apart when investigators discovered damning evidence in the form of phone records and bank transactions that linked him to payments made to Henry Croft during the time Jane Chung had gone missing. Hale had orchestrated the stalking, using Croft to terrorize Jane into submission, all while controlling Mark through financial blackmail. But Croft wasn't the only pawn in Hale's game. Through further investigation, police uncovered that Hale had another man on his payroll, a man who fit the description of the person Croft had called the one in charge. This man had been seen with Jane at the scene motel, the same man Croft had spotted meeting her in the days leading up to her disappearance. His name was Gary Rowland, a small-time enforcer with a violent reputation. It was Rowland who had likely forced Jane into hiding, ultimately leading to her years of amnesia and the fragmented memories of her past. When confronted, Rowland admitted that he had been ordered to handle Jane, but he claimed she had escaped before things could turn deadly. According to Rowland, Jane had fled the motel in a panic, and he had been told to back off. With no further orders from Hale, Rowland had let her go, assuming she had disappeared for good. The pieces finally fell into place. Jane, terrified for her life, had tried to escape not just her affair but the powerful men controlling her every move. When she disappeared in 1995, she had been fleeing a web of blackmail and threats, but the trauma of those years had fractured her mind. She had lost her memory, wandering from state to state, trying to survive without knowing who she really was. In the end, Robert Hale was charged with a litany of crimes, including conspiracy, blackmail, and his role in Jane's disappearance. Henry Croft and Gary Rowland were also charged for their parts in stalking and terrorizing Jane. As for Mark, he was cleared of any direct involvement but struggled to come to terms with the role his financial dealings had played in the nightmare his family endured. Jane, now fully aware of her past, faced an uncertain future. The woman who had returned was not the same suburban mother who had disappeared 20 years ago. She would never be. But with the truth finally exposed, she could begin to rebuild her life, one painful memory at a time. Madison, Ryan, and Emily stood by her side, determined to support her, though the scars of their broken childhood would take years to heal. Mark, too, faced the long road of recovery, trying to mend the shattered remains of the family he had once held so dear. The town of Larkwood would never forget the disappearance of Jane Whitman, a suburban mother who had become a symbol of secrets too dark to stay hidden. In the end, the truth had come to light, but the cost had been far higher than anyone could have imagined. In the aftermath of the shocking revelations, the small town of Larkwood struggled to process the complex and tragic saga of Jane Whitman's disappearance. News outlets followed the story closely, but as the legal proceedings against Robert Hale, Henry Croft, and Gary Rowland concluded, the frenzy slowly faded. Life in Larkwood resumed its familiar pace, yet the scars left behind by the 20-year mystery would remain etched in the community's memory. For Jane Whitman, the journey toward healing was just beginning. After years of wandering through the fog of lost memories and confusion, she now faced the overwhelming task of confronting the truth. She spent months in therapy, working to unravel the fragments of her past and piece together the woman she had once been with the one she had become. Madison, Ryan, and Emily had their own paths to navigate. Madison, the eldest, had been carrying the weight of the family for so long that letting go of her anger was not easy. She had spent years resenting her mother's disappearance, but now, understanding the trauma and terror Jane had faced, she felt both grief and relief. Slowly, she allowed herself to rebuild a relationship with the woman who had returned. Ryan, always the quiet and introspective one, grappled with the revelation that his mother had been a victim of forces beyond her control. His analytical mind found it hard to reconcile the loving mother he remembered with the shadowy figure of Jane's lost years, but therapy helped him to process the pain and confusion that had haunted his childhood. Emily, the youngest, had been just a child when Jane disappeared, her memories of her mother fragmented and blurred by time. As an adult, she found it easier to accept Jane for who she was now. For Emily, this was not the return of a mother she had lost, it was a chance to get to know the woman she barely remembered. Mark, however, faced the hardest road of all. While he had been cleared of any criminal wrongdoing, the guilt over his involvement with Robert Hale lingered like a shadow over his heart. He had unknowingly placed his wife in harm's way through his financial entanglements, and that burden was one he would carry for the rest of his life. Though he and Jane attempted to rekindle their relationship, the emotional distance between them had grown too wide. After months of painful attempts to rebuild, they eventually made the difficult decision to part ways amicably. Their love had once been strong, but too much had changed in the 20 years they had been apart. As the legal dust settled, Jane chose to leave Larkwood. The town held too many memories, both good and bad, and she needed a fresh start, far from the streets that had once been her home. With Madison's help, she moved to a quiet town on the Oregon coast, where she could begin again, far from the prying eyes of the media and the endless questions. Though the wounds of the past would never fully heal, Jane found a sense of peace in the new life she built for herself. She reconnected with old hobbies, took up painting, and spent her days walking along the beach, reflecting on the strange journey her life had taken. Slowly, the nightmares began to fade, and while the memories of her lost years still haunted her, they no longer had the power to control her. Back in Larkwood, Madison, Ryan, and Emily continued to grow their own lives, visiting their mother regularly. Despite the years lost, they found comfort in the time they now had with her, a chance to create new memories and rebuild the bonds that had been broken. The Whitman family had been through the unimaginable, but they emerged stronger in ways they hadn't expected. The mystery of Jane Whitman's disappearance had consumed them for 2 decades, but now, with the truth finally revealed, they were free to move forward. In the end, the story of Jane Whitman wasn't just about her disappearance. It was about survival, resilience, and the ability to rebuild after the darkest of storms. Though the truth had come at a great cost, it had also brought with it the possibility of healing and, perhaps most importantly, the hope of a new beginning.